Hello, everyone. I want to take a second look at Peter Singer's essay, Famine, Affluence, and Morality. I want to point out something here. This is on page 836 and the third paragraph that I think is worth noting and keeping in mind. He says, in arguing for this conclusion, and the conclusion is what? We should look, I suppose, at a paragraph earlier. He says, what are the moral implications of a situation like this? He's just described the suffering of people of East Bengal, a place that became Bangladesh, and what he would regard as the woefully inadequate response on the part of more affluent countries in terms of providing aid that would prevent the suffering and death that's happening there. He says, what are the moral implications of a situation like this? In what follows, I shall argue that the way people in relatively affluent countries react to a situation like that in Bengal cannot be justified. Indeed, the whole way we look at moral issues, our moral conceptual scheme needs to be altered. And with it, the way of life that has come to be taken for granted in our society. So he regards his conclusion here, his overall message, as quite revolutionary in terms of changing the way that we approach things. But what I'd like to concentrate on is what he says next. He says, in arguing for this conclusion, I will not, of course, claim to be morally neutral. That is, clearly wants people to do something to alleviate suffering, not only in places like East Bengal, but all over the world. But he says, I shall, however, try to argue for the moral position that I take, so that anyone who accepts certain assumptions to be made explicit will, I hope, accept my conclusion. I wanted to focus on that. That is, Singer proceeds dialectically. And what that means is that he suggests certain premises and asks you to accept them. And if you don't accept them, then he acknowledges that his argument will have that his argument will not be persuasive to you. But if you do accept the premises, then he says that you simply must accept the necessary conclusions that follow from them. So that is a certain strategy of arguing. It goes back to Socrates, at least. That is, that we proceed from premises that are acceptable to all parties involved, and then we see what follows from them. And that's the way we sort of discover things, by looking at the implications. Now, if you don't accept those premises, then you are not compelled to accept the implications that follow from them. But if you do accept the premises, then reason being what it is, you should accept what follows from them. And the strategy is to begin with something that would be not controversial, something that would be widely acceptable to people. That is, if you proceed dialectically, you want to start from shared premises. So those premises should be as obvious and as non-controversial as possible if you want your argument to be persuasive to people, because you want them to freely accept your premises. So you make them as obvious as possible. And that's what he does here. He says, I begin with the assumption that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. That's the first premise assumption that he's asking you to share, that suffering and death from lack of food, shelter, and medical care are bad. And as he says, I think most people will agree about this. Although one may reach the same view by different routes, I shall not argue for this view. That was my point. These are premises, beginning points. He says people can hold all sorts of eccentric positions, and perhaps from some of them it would not follow that death by starvation is in itself bad. It is difficult, perhaps impossible, to refute such positions, and so for brevity I will henceforth take this assumption as accepted. Those who disagree need read no further. Right? So again, proceeding dialectically, let's start with some shared premises, and the first one is that suffering and death from lack of these resources is bad. And how does he proceed next? He says, my next point is this: if it is in our power to prevent something bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, we ought morally to do it. And that is another premise that he's asking you to accept. It's not something that he is arguing for. It's something that he expects most people to accept. That is, that if we can prevent something bad from happening, and we do not really need to sacrifice much of any importance, something of comparable moral importance. And moral importance means importance to our own welfare. Right? If somebody is bleeding to death on the pavement as you walk by, to stop and actually help staunch the bleeding is a sacrifice on your part. It's a sacrifice of your time. It's a sacrifice of your effort, and it perhaps is a sacrifice of, getting bloody and upset, right? However, that sacrifice on your part is not of the same moral importance as the thing that you're trying to prevent, somebody bleeding to death. That's what he means by moral importance there. Importance in terms of welfare. The moral importance of bleeding to death to the person who's bleeding is much higher than the moral importance of spending some time, maybe getting your clothes bloody, things like that. The moral importance of that to the person who seeks to help them. So, right. So he says, without sacrificing anything of comparable moral importance, I mean, without causing anything else comparably bad to happen, right? So it should be clear what he means there. Or doing something that is wrong in itself, or failing to promote some moral good comparable in significance to the bad that we can prevent. This principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. Again, see how he's proceeding. He is proposing premises that he is not arguing for, but seem to be immediately acceptable to the average person, that suffering death from lack of resources is bad, that if we can prevent a bad without sacrificing something of similar importance, we should. So he says, this principle seems almost as uncontroversial as the last one. It requires us only to prevent what is bad and not promote what is good. And it requires this of us only when we can do it without sacrificing anything it is, from the moral point of view, comparably important. I could even, as far as the application of my argument to the Bengal emergency is concerned, qualify the point so as to make it, if it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything morally significant, we ought morally to do so. You see how he's making it even more acceptable, in the sense he's making it less strenuous, right? If we can prevent something very bad from happening without sacrificing anything that's morally significant, then we ought morally to do so. And then he gives you the application of that principle. If I'm walking past a shallow pond and see a child drowning in it, I ought to wade in and pull the child out. This will mean getting my clothes muddy, but this is insignificant, while the death of the child would presumably be a very bad thing. So he's given you two versions of this principle, I suppose, to say, well, if you don't accept one, perhaps you'll accept the other. The second one being much less stringent. If I can prevent something very bad from happening without making anything, without sacrificing anything morally significant, and I suppose muddy clothes are just not morally significant, then I should do so. So that he's gotten you to accept these two premises if you're following along with him. And then the question is what actually follows. That is, if you do accept these principles, these premises, then you should accept what follows from them. And if you accept these things, then you should also accept whatever logically follows from them. So he continues and says, the uncontroversial appearance of the principle just stated is deceptive if it were acted upon, even in its qualified form. And I suppose the qualified form, he means the second less demanding form. Our lives, our society, and our world would be fundamentally changed. For the principle takes, firstly, no account of proximity or distance. It makes no moral difference whether the person I can help is a neighbor's child 10 yards from me, or a Bengali whose name I shall never know 10,000 miles away. That is, there's no, in the principles that we accepted, there was no qualification or no exception made or no notion of the relevance of proximity to me. It would seem that the suffering of people all over the world is of equal value. And it would seem that if I can do something to stop that suffering, whether that person is 1,000 miles away or whether that person is right next to me, the duty that is embedded in the second principle is equally strong. It's not affected. Secondly, he says the principle makes no distinction between cases in which I am the only person who could possibly do anything and cases which I am just one among millions in the same position. So just want to focus just on this one small but absolutely crucial part of his argument, and just to stress that what he's doing is, again, proceeding dialectically in his argument, saying, well, here are some premises. I'm not going to argue for them, but I'm going to present them to you and see if you find them acceptable. And if you don't find them acceptable, then ignore everything else that I say. If you do find them acceptable, that is, if you think that they're true, then what follows from them? And what follows from them, if what follows from them is a necessary implication of the principles themselves, then you should accept that too. So that's basically, the way that he's proceeding, and then the ultimate implication is that we have to give. If we're going to follow our own moral beliefs, right?